All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 5, Section 5, Disaffection, the First Continental Congress and American Identity. So in this section, we are primarily looking at the colonial response to the Coercive Acts. Coercive Acts. Of course, these are also called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts. And we gave last section a whole sort of laundry list of the different laws that Parliament passed on the colony of Massachusetts in an effort to punish them. Now, Massachusetts had had its colonial assembly dissolved, its government essentially made illegal by Great Britain. And so the people of Massachusetts instead met in the provincial congress, and these provincial congresses, do begin to sprout up really around the colonial world. They're sort of like, we're just going to call them popular, quote unquote, shadow governments. They're not legal, at least from the eyes of the British, but, they're groups of people who don't trust British authority, and they're meeting off the grid, so to speak, in an effort to try and, communicate and continue to pass laws that are in their best interests. And the Massachusetts Provincial Congress puts forward the Suffolk Resolves, which is a plan of action in response to coercive acts. Right? So it's the plan of action for the coercive acts. It eventually becomes adopted by the First Continental Congress. So maybe we'll go ahead and make note of that. Later adopted by the First Continental Congress. All right, so that's going on in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the other colonies see what's happening in Massachusetts, and there's been a very important shift in the way that the other colonies think. Previously, especially before the 7 Years' War, anything that had happened to Massachusetts from the perspective of the other colonies, they would say, well, look, that is Massachusetts' problem. Let them deal with it. We're here in our own colony, and, we're kind of more focused on what we're doing. But with events like the Boston Massacre, and especially now with the Coercive Acts, that became a real turning point. And in the other colonial assemblies, there was a debate about whether or not what happens in Massachusetts is their problem and not our problem, or the other side of it, which was winning at this time, or did win at this time, was that if they can do that to Massachusetts, they can do that to us. And so therefore, we need to take action. And that's eventually the argument that won out in most other colonies. They said, look, if Great Britain can pass these types of laws against the colony of Massachusetts, they can pass them on us here in Virginia or Maryland or Georgia or Delaware or wherever it was. Therefore, we need to come together and do something about it. And that's exactly what they did. The First Continental Congress was a meeting of the 12 colonies in Philadelphia, right? That was where they met. So the First Continental Congress is a colonial meeting in response to coercive acts. And there wasn't really a strong agreement on exactly what to do. However, the Suffolk Resolves seemed to be a pretty reasonable solution. So eventually the First Continental Congress did adopt that. And what they decided was a number of things. First, they demanded the repeal of the Coercive Acts. So we might say, demand a repeal of the Coercive Acts. This was Great Britain going too far. In an effort to try and put more pressure on the British in doing so, something that was successful in the past was to promote and engage in non-importation or non-consumption of British goods. This worked with the Stamp Act. It would work again, right, to boycott. And something that was a little bit different, because remember, since the Stamp Act, there had been violent episodes like the Boston Massacre. And so just in case, because violence is now a real possibility, the First Continental Congress encouraged each colony to prepare their militias, right? So we might say about militias, colonies to prepare militias, right? Kind of, just in case kind of sort of situation. And in fact, at this point, you also found people who were in these militias that were a little bit too loyal to Great Britain were being expelled at this point. And so the militias themselves preparing for what sort of response it might have. Additionally, the First Continental Congress also created the Continental Association, and this was a body to enforce boycotting. And really what you have here with the First Continental Congress is, again, sort of a very, very early version of what could be a United States, at least in the sense of passing a sort of uniform, it's not formally a law, but it's kind of like a law, right? This was meant to enforce the boycotting of British goods in all colonies. It wasn't just each individual colony that promoted that. So this is kind of a slow sort of step by step to a more united colonial government emerging out of this particular conflict. Now, the members, or those who were at the First Continental Congress, again, sent this demand to Britain. It would take a little while for it to get there and for the British to respond and send a response back. So they did all these things, right? Demand a repeal, send that back to Britain, boycott goods, prepare your militias, enforce the boycotting. And they said that they would meet 1 year later at a second Continental Congress. And by that time, by that meeting, everything had really gone haywire, so to speak. However, an important point to take note of is that here in 1774, the First Continental Congress, there was a very strong insistence that the members of the Continental Congress were still British subjects. In other words, they were still very strongly loyal, only with a very small percentage of people there advocating for something like separation. So in the meantime, while Congress awaits Britain's response, again, think about it from the colonial perspective, they're doing pretty much the same thing they did during the Stamp Act. Come together, send a petition, boycott British goods, and they were met with the repeal of the Stamp Act. They're hoping for a similar outcome, right? Come together, demand a repeal of the Coercive Acts, boycott British goods, wait 1 year later, and then hopefully at the Second Continental Congress, right, everybody bring the champagne bottles, and there'll be a huge celebration. However, 1 year later, the circumstances turn out to be dramatically different.